Admiral William Hayes adjusted his crisp white uniform as he walked through the bustling corridors of the Pentagon. At 52, he commanded respect wherever he went, his chest adorned with ribbons that told stories of modern naval victories and strategic brilliance. Today was supposed to be routine, a ceremonial lunch honoring veterans from various conflicts, the kind of public relations event that came with his rank. The grand ballroom buzzed with conversation as distinguished guests mingled over cocktails. Hayes moved through the crowd with practiced ease, shaking hands and exchanging pleasantries with senators, defense contractors, and fellow officers. His smile was genuine but measured, the kind perfected through years of diplomatic functions. Near the far corner of the room, Hayes noticed an elderly man sitting alone at a small table. The veteran appeared to be in his late 70s, wearing a faded dress uniform that had clearly seen better days. His gray hair was neatly combed, and despite his age, he sat with military posture that spoke of decades of discipline. What caught Hayes's attention was how isolated the man seemed. While everyone else networked and socialized, this veteran sat quietly, occasionally sipping from a glass of water. Hayes felt a familiar tug of duty. He had always made it a point to speak with the older veterans at these events, believing their stories deserved to be heard. These men had served when warfare was different, more personal, more brutal in ways his generation could barely comprehend. Walking over with his characteristic confident stride, Hayes extended his hand. "Good afternoon. I'm Admiral Hayes. I don't believe we've been introduced." The old man looked up slowly, his pale blue eyes meeting Hayes's with a clarity that seemed to cut through decades. There was something unsettling about that gaze. It held depths that spoke of experiences far beyond typical military service. "Thomas Mitchell," the veteran replied, his voice steady but quiet. His handshake was firm despite his age, calloused hands that had clearly seen hard work. "Thank you for the invitation, Admiral. It's quite an honor to be here." Hayes settled into the chair across from Mitchell, genuinely curious about the man's background. "What branch did you serve in, Thomas? And during which conflict?" It was his standard opening question, usually leading to stories about Korea, Vietnam, or sometimes World War II if the veteran was old enough. Mitchell's expression remained neutral, but Hayes noticed a slight tightening around his eyes. "Navy, sir. Special operations. Mostly classified work during the Cold War." The response was measured, careful, like a man who had spent decades being cautious about what he revealed. The Admiral leaned forward slightly, his interest piqued. Special operations during the Cold War meant this man had likely been involved in some of the most secretive and dangerous missions of his era. That must have been challenging work. "I imagine you have some incredible stories, though I understand if you can't share them." For a moment, Mitchell said nothing, his fingers drumming silently on the white tablecloth. Around them, the cocktail chatter continued, but Hayes found himself completely focused on this mysterious veteran. There was something about Thomas Mitchell that didn't quite fit. His uniform bore no unit insignia, no campaign ribbons, nothing that would indicate where he had served or what he had done. Some stories are better left buried. "Admiral," Mitchell finally said, his voice carrying a weight that made Hayes pause. "But time has a way of bringing things to the surface, whether we want them to or not." The cryptic response only deepened Hayes's curiosity, and he found himself studying the old man more carefully. "Well, I'd be honored to hear anything you're comfortable sharing," Hayes said, settling back in his chair. He had nowhere else to be for the next hour, and something about Thomas Mitchell intrigued him in a way he couldn't quite explain. "After all, it's veterans like you who paved the way for officers like me." Mitchell smiled for the first time since Hayes had sat down, but it wasn't a pleasant expression. It was the kind of smile that held secrets, the kind that suggested the person wearing it knew things that would change everything if spoken aloud. "You're very kind, Admiral. But I wonder if you'd feel the same way if you knew what some of us really did in service to our country." The comment hung in the air between them like a challenge, and Hayes felt the first stirring of unease. There was something about Thomas Mitchell that was beginning to feel less like a routine veteran encounter, and more like something else entirely, though he couldn't yet put his finger on what that something might be. Admiral Hayes studied Thomas Mitchell more carefully, noticing details he had missed during their initial introduction. The man's uniform, while clean and pressed, bore subtle signs that suggested it wasn't quite standard issue. The fabric was slightly different, the cut not quite matching regulation patterns Hayes knew intimately. More puzzling was the complete absence of any identifying marks. No name tape, no unit patches, no service ribbons that would normally tell the story of a naval career. "I've spent 30 years in the Navy," Hayes said carefully, "and I've learned that every veteran's service matters regardless of what they did." The Cold War was a different kind of conflict, requiring different kinds of courage. He was fishing now, trying to draw Mitchell out while maintaining the respectful tone these conversations demanded. Mitchell nodded slowly, his pale eyes never leaving Hayes's face. "Different indeed, Admiral. Tell me, in your experience, how far should a sailor go in service to his country? Where do you draw the line between duty and conscience?" The question was delivered in the same quiet tone, but Hayes sensed the weight behind it. Before Hayes could respond, a younger officer approached their table. "Admiral Hayes, sir? Secretary Morrison is asking for you." Hayes glanced up, recognizing Lieutenant Commander Sarah Chen from his staff. Her timing couldn't have been worse. He was just beginning to crack the mystery of Thomas Mitchell. "Give me 5 more minutes, Commander," Hayes replied, his tone indicating this wasn't a request. Chen nodded and retreated, though Hayes noticed her curious glance at Mitchell. "I'm sorry, Thomas. You were saying about duty and conscience?" Mitchell's weathered hands folded together on the table. "In 1967, I was 23 years old and thought I knew everything about right and wrong. The Navy had different ideas about moral clarity in those days. Sometimes we were asked to do things that—" He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. "Things that weren't supposed to exist, if you understand my meaning." Hayes leaned forward slightly. Black operations weren't uncommon during the Cold War, though they were rarely discussed openly even decades later. "I understand the nature of classified work, Thomas. Sometimes difficult decisions have to be made for the greater good." "The greater good," Mitchell repeated, and there was something bitter in his tone. "That's what they told us. National security, protecting American interests, stopping the spread of communism. All very noble causes, Admiral. But what happens when you discover that everything you've been told is a lie?" The question hung between them like an accusation. Hayes felt his professional instincts kicking in. This conversation was veering into territory that made him uncomfortable. Veterans suffering from delayed stress reactions sometimes developed conspiracy theories about their service, and he didn't want to encourage such thinking. "Thomas, I understand that some operations during that era were complex, but our intelligence services have always operated within the bounds of law and necessity." Even as he said it, Hayes knew how naive it sounded. He'd been in the military long enough to know that the boundaries of law and necessity were often subject to interpretation. Mitchell's smile returned, that unsettling expression that suggested he knew something Hayes didn't. "Within the bounds of law, yes, that's what they teach at the Naval Academy, isn't it? Clean operations, noble purposes, clear chains of command. Tell me, Admiral, have you ever heard of Operation Ghost 5? The name hit Hayes like a physical blow. He kept his expression carefully neutral, but his mind was racing. Operation Ghost 5 wasn't something that should be known outside the highest levels of naval intelligence. It wasn't something that should be discussed at a public function, and it certainly wasn't something an aging veteran should know about. "I'm not familiar with that operation," Hayes said carefully, though his tone had shifted subtly. Mitchell noticed the change immediately, his pale eyes brightening with something that might have been satisfaction. "Of course you wouldn't be," Mitchell said softly. It was buried so deep that most people involved didn't even know what they were really doing. Compartmentalized beyond belief. Need-to-know basis taken to an extreme that would make the CIA proud. But some of us knew, Admiral. Some of us knew exactly what we were doing, and some of us have been living with that knowledge for 57 years. Hayes felt his mouth go dry. Operation Ghost 5 was classified at levels that required presidential authorization just to acknowledge its existence. The fact that this elderly veteran not only knew the name but seemed to have intimate knowledge of its structure meant that Thomas Mitchell was either completely delusional or exactly who he claimed to be, and both possibilities were equally terrifying. "Thomas," Hayes said quietly, "I think we should discuss this somewhere more private." His eyes swept the crowded ballroom, suddenly aware of how public their conversation had become. Whatever Operation Ghost 5 was, it wasn't something that should be discussed within earshot of defense contractors and congressional staffers. Mitchell shook his head slowly. Privacy won't change the facts, Admiral. And after all these years, I'm not particularly concerned about secrecy anymore. Sometimes the only way to find peace is to tell the truth, regardless of the consequences. Admiral Hayes felt sweat forming on his forehead despite the ballroom's air conditioning. Operation Ghost 5 represented one of the darkest chapters in naval intelligence history. A program so classified that knowledge of its existence was limited to fewer than a dozen people worldwide. The fact that Thomas Mitchell not only knew about it but spoke of it with such casual familiarity sent ice through Hayes's veins. Thomas, I really must insist we continue this conversation in private, Hayes said, his voice barely above a whisper. What you're discussing involves matters of national security that— National security, Mitchell interrupted, his voice gaining strength. Do you know what we did in the name of national security, Admiral? Do you know what Operation Ghost 5 really was? His pale eyes burned with an intensity that made Hayes deeply uncomfortable. Around them, the cocktail party continued its civilized chaos, but Hayes felt as though he and Mitchell existed in a bubble of tension that no one else could perceive. He glanced toward the exit, calculating how quickly he could extract himself from this situation while maintaining diplomatic protocol. Mitchell seemed to read his thoughts. Running away won't change history, Admiral, and it won't change what I'm about to tell you. He leaned forward, his voice dropping to barely audible levels. Operation Ghost 5 was a human experimentation program, psychological warfare testing conducted on prisoners of war, defectors, and sometimes our own personnel. Hayes felt his world shift slightly off its axis. That's impossible, he said automatically. The United States military doesn't conduct experiments on human subjects. We have protocols, oversight committees, international treaties. In 1967, Mitchell's laugh was bitter. Admiral, you're thinking with a 21st century mindset about 20th century operations. Things were different then. The Cold War made monsters of good men and good men of monsters. We were told we were fighting for the survival of democracy itself. Any means necessary to prevent nuclear war seemed justified. Hayes found his hands gripping the edge of the table. Everything about this conversation violated his understanding of naval history and American military ethics. Yet something in Mitchell's tone, the specific way he spoke about classified operations, suggested he possessed insider knowledge that went far beyond what any conspiracy theorist could fabricate. You're telling me you participated in human experimentation? Hayes asked, his voice hollow. Participated? Mitchell's expression darkened. Admiral, I was the lead psychological operations specialist for Ghost 5. I designed the protocols. I supervised the sessions. I wrote the reports that justified expanding the program. For 3 years, I was one of the most effective interrogators the Navy ever produced. The admission hung between them like a confession in a cathedral. Hayes studied Mitchell's face, looking for signs of delusion or fabrication, but found only the steady gaze of a man stating facts he had lived with for decades. The program operated out of a facility in the Philippines, Mitchell continued, his voice taking on the methodical tone of someone reciting a well-rehearsed report. Substation Baker 7, officially designated as a communications monitoring post. In reality, it housed 12 interrogation cells, a medical facility, and living quarters for 43 personnel. We processed approximately 200 subjects over the course of the operation. Hayes felt sick. Subjects? Prisoners of war from Vietnam, Soviet defectors who had information we needed, Chinese intelligence operatives captured in Southeast Asia, and— Mitchell paused, his composure cracking slightly, and American personnel who had been exposed to enemy psychological warfare techniques. We told ourselves we were helping them, deprogramming them, saving them from enemy conditioning. This is impossible, Hayes repeated, but his voice lacked conviction. He had seen enough classified documents in his career to know that the impossible was often simply the highly classified. Mitchell reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew a small, yellowed photograph. He placed it on the table between them, face down. Ghost 5 was shut down in January 1970, Admiral, not because of moral concerns, but because one of our subjects died during a session. Officially, Petty Officer James Warren died of a heart condition while stationed in the Philippines. Unofficially, he died of cardiac arrest induced by stress positions and sleep deprivation. Hayes stared at the photograph without turning it over. Why are you telling me this? Because James Warren was my nephew, Mitchell said quietly. My sister's boy, 19 years old, captured during a reconnaissance mission in Cambodia. The Navy told my family he had been killed in action. They gave him a hero's burial, full military honors. My sister never knew that her son died in an American facility, at the hands of American personnel under my supervision. The weight of the revelation settled over Hayes like a lead blanket. He understood now why Mitchell had sought him out, why this conversation was happening here in public, where it couldn't be easily dismissed or covered up. Thomas, Hayes said carefully, if what you're saying is true, then you're confessing to war crimes. You understand that, don't you? Mitchell nodded slowly. I've understood that for 57 years, Admiral. The question is, what are you going to do about it? Admiral Hayes stared at the overturned photograph on the table, his mind reeling from the implications of Mitchell's confession. The civilized atmosphere of the Pentagon ballroom seemed surreal now, as if he were watching the cocktail party through bulletproof glass. Distinguished guests continued their conversations about defense budgets and military strategy, completely unaware that a few feet away, the foundation of everything Hayes believed about naval honor was crumbling. You need to understand something, Admiral, Mitchell continued, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what he was revealing. I didn't seek you out randomly. I've been watching your career for years, reading about your positions on military ethics, your speeches about accountability and transparency. You represent everything the Navy claims to stand for now. Hayes felt trapped between professional duty and personal horror. Thomas, even if what you're saying is true, the statute of limitations for these alleged crimes expired decades ago. And without corroborating evidence, Mitchell reached into his other jacket pocket and withdrew a manila envelope, yellowed with age. I kept everything, Admiral. Personnel files, operation reports, medical records, photographs of the facility, even audio recordings of some sessions. I told myself I was keeping them for security purposes, but the truth is I knew someday I'd need proof of what we did. The envelope sat on the table like an unexploded bomb. Hayes understood that opening it would change everything, not just for him personally, but potentially for the entire Navy. Operations like Ghost 5, if they truly existed, represented institutional failures that could destroy careers, topple administrations, and shatter public trust in the military. Why now? Hayes asked. Why reveal this after all these years? Mitchell's weathered face showed the first signs of vulnerability Hayes had seen. Because I'm dying, Admiral. Pancreatic cancer. The doctors give me 3 months, maybe 4. And because my granddaughter is about to graduate from the Naval Academy. She's going to serve her country with the same idealism I had when I was 23. She deserves to serve an institution that acknowledges its past mistakes. The personal dimension of Mitchell's revelation added another layer of complexity to an already impossible situation. Hayes could see the old man's pain, not just physical but the deeper anguish of a lifetime spent carrying secrets that had poisoned his soul. What exactly do you want from me? Hayes asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. I want you to turn over the photograph, Mitchell said simply. Look at what Ghost 5 really was. Then decide whether the Navy you serve today is capable of confronting the Navy of 50 years ago. Hayes hesitated, his hand hovering over the photograph. He understood that this moment represented a crossroads. He could refuse to look, walk away, and report Mitchell as a delusional veteran spreading unfounded conspiracy theories. Or he could confront whatever truth Mitchell was offering, with all the consequences that might follow. Before I do this, Hayes said slowly, I need to know something. How do I verify your identity? How do I know you're really who you claim to be? Mitchell smiled, and for the first time it seemed genuine rather than bitter. Smart question, Admiral. Check my service records under the name Thomas Mitchell, Navy Intelligence Division, 1965 to 1971. But you won't find anything about Ghost 5 in the official files. That operation was buried so deep it never officially existed. However, you will find a commendation I received in 1969 for exceptional service in support of intelligence operations in Southeast Asia. The commendation was signed by Admiral Richard Kellison. Hayes knew that name. Kellison had been a legendary figure in naval intelligence, known for his innovative approaches to psychological warfare. If Mitchell was fabricating his story, he had chosen details that could be verified through official channels. There's something else, Mitchell continued. Check the casualty reports for Petty Officer James Warren. Died January 15, 1970. Officially listed as heart failure while stationed in the Philippines. Then cross-reference that with medical reports from Substation Baker 7 for the same time period. You'll find discrepancies that only make sense if you know what really happened. Hayes realized that Mitchell had thought this through carefully, providing him with enough verifiable information to check his story through official channels. The old man wasn't asking him to take everything on faith. He was offering a trail of evidence that could either confirm or refute his claims. "Thomas," Hayes said quietly, "if what you're telling me is true, then this goes far beyond just you and me. This is institutional corruption at the highest levels. It would implicate dozens of officers, multiple commands, possibly even civilian leadership." "Now you're beginning to understand the scope of what Ghost 5 represented," Mitchell replied. "It wasn't the work of a few rogue operators, Admiral. It was a systematic program with official authorization, proper funding, and detailed oversight. The people who designed and approved Ghost 5 went on to have distinguished careers in intelligence and military leadership." Hayes felt the weight of decision pressing down on him. Whatever was in that envelope and underneath that photograph would change everything. There would be no going back to the comfortable certainty he had felt just an hour ago. "If I look at this evidence," Hayes said, "what do you expect me to do with it?" Mitchell's pale eyes met his directly. "I expect you to do what a real naval officer would do, Admiral. I expect you to choose honor over convenience." Admiral Hayes took a deep breath and reached for the photograph. His fingers trembled slightly as he turned it over, revealing a black and white image that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The photograph showed a concrete room with no windows, harsh fluorescent lighting, and what appeared to be a young man strapped to a chair. Medical equipment surrounded the chair, and several figures in military uniforms stood nearby, their faces partially visible. "Interrogation Room 3 at Substation Baker 7, Mitchell said quietly. "The subject is Petty Officer Warren. The session was conducted on January 12, 1970, 3 days before he died. I'm the figure on the left taking notes." Hayes studied the photograph with growing horror. The young man in the chair appeared unconscious, his head lolling to one side. Electrodes were attached to his temples, and an IV line ran into his arm. This wasn't interrogation. It was torture conducted under the auspices of the United States Navy. "What were you doing to him?" Hayes asked, his voice barely audible. "Sensory deprivation combined with chemical enhancement," Mitchell replied, his tone clinical despite the obvious pain in his eyes. "We had developed techniques that could break down psychological resistance in 72 hours or less. The theory was that subjects exposed to enemy propaganda could be deprogrammed using the same methods, then sent back into the field with artificial memories of their capture and escape." Hayes set the photograph down carefully, as if it might explode. "You were erasing people's memories?" "Attempting to, yes. The science was primitive compared to what's possible today, but we had some success." Warren had been captured during a reconnaissance mission and held by North Vietnamese forces for 6 weeks. When he was recovered, intelligence believed he had been subjected to intensive psychological conditioning. The decision was made to bring him to Baker 7 for deprogramming. "But he wasn't a prisoner of war," Hayes said, understanding dawning. "He was American personnel." "That's correct, Admiral." "Which made him a perfect test subject for our techniques. We told ourselves we were helping him, removing traumatic memories and enemy conditioning. In reality, we were trying to perfect methods that could be used on captured enemy personnel." Hayes opened the manila envelope with hands that shook noticeably. Inside were dozens of documents, personnel files, medical reports, operation summaries, and more photographs. The paperwork bore official Navy letterhead and the signatures of officers Hayes recognized from naval history. This wasn't the work of rogue operators. It was an officially sanctioned program with proper documentation and oversight. "Admiral Kellison knew about this," Hayes said, reading through a status report dated September 1969. "Admiral Kellison designed the program," Mitchell corrected. "He believed that psychological warfare would be the deciding factor in future conflicts. Ghost 5 was his attempt to give the Navy a decisive advantage in intelligence gathering and personnel recovery operations." Hayes found himself looking at medical reports that documented the systematic breakdown of human subjects, sleep deprivation, sensory manipulation, chemical interrogation, and what the reports euphemistically called memory reconstruction. The clinical language couldn't disguise the fundamental inhumanity of what had been done. How many people knew about this? Hayes asked. The full scope? Maybe 20 people across the entire chain of command. But hundreds of personnel were involved in various aspects of the operation. Guards, medical staff, communications personnel, logistics support. Most of them believed they were supporting legitimate intelligence operations. Hayes was beginning to understand the institutional implications of Mitchell's revelation. Ghost 5 hadn't been a secret program hidden from oversight. It had been a classified program with proper authorization that had simply been buried when it became inconvenient. What happened when Warren died? Mitchell's composure finally cracked slightly. Panic, complete institutional panic. The program was shut down within 48 hours. All personnel were reassigned to different commands scattered across the globe. The facility was abandoned and later destroyed in what was officially reported as an accidental fire. All records were supposed to be destroyed, but you kept copies. I kept everything. Every document, every photograph, every audio recording. I told myself it was insurance, protection against being made a scapegoat if the program was ever exposed. But the truth is, I knew we had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. Hayes looked around the ballroom again, suddenly seeing his colleagues and peers in a different light. How many of them knew about operations like Ghost 5? How many similar programs had existed over the decades, buried beneath layers of classification and institutional amnesia? Thomas, this information could destroy the Navy's reputation. It could undermine public trust in the military, affect recruitment, damage international relationships. Are you prepared for those consequences? Mitchell's pale eyes blazed with determination. Admiral, for 57 years I've watched the Navy receive praise and honor for protecting American values, while knowing that we violated those same values in the worst possible ways. I've watched officers receive promotions and decorations while carrying secrets that would horrify the public they claim to serve. I'm dying and I refuse to take these secrets to my grave. Hayes realized that Mitchell had maneuvered him into an impossible position. As a serving officer, he had a duty to report potential war crimes. But as a Navy admiral, he understood that such a revelation could have catastrophic consequences for the institution he had devoted his life to serving. What exactly do you want me to do with this information? Hayes asked. I want you to ensure that James Warren's family knows the truth about how he died. Mitchell said, I want the Navy to acknowledge what happened at Substation Baker 7. And I want guarantees that nothing like Ghost 5 will ever happen again. Hayes understood that his next decision would define not only the rest of his career, but the kind of officer and the kind of man he truly was. Admiral Hayes sat in stunned silence, the weight of Mitchell's documentation feeling heavier than his 30 years of service medals. The cocktail party continued around them, but the sound seemed muffled, distant, as if they existed in a separate reality where the comfortable certainties of military honor had been stripped away. He found himself staring at a photograph of young James Warren, remembering his own nephew who had just enlisted in the Navy with stars in his eyes. You understand what you're asking me to do, Hayes said finally. You're asking me to destroy my own institution. Mitchell shook his head slowly. I'm asking you to save it, Admiral. Institutions that can't confront their past mistakes are doomed to repeat them. The Navy of today is not the Navy of 1970, but it's still carrying the poison of unacknowledged crimes. That poison spreads through the ranks in ways you might not even recognize. Hayes thought about his own career, the classified operations he had overseen, the moral compromises that seemed reasonable in the context of national security. How many times had he approved actions that existed in ethical gray areas? How many Thomas Mitchells were sitting in nursing homes and retirement communities, carrying secrets that would shatter public trust if revealed? There has to be another way, Hayes said desperately. Some kind of internal review. A classified investigation that doesn't become public knowledge. We could ensure that nothing like Ghost 5 happens again without destroying public confidence in the military. Internal reviews are how cover-ups begin, Admiral. I've watched the Navy bury inconvenient truths for decades. Do you really believe that an institution capable of authorizing Ghost 5 is capable of honestly investigating itself? Mitchell's voice carried the weight of bitter experience. Hayes looked around the ballroom again, seeing familiar faces in a new light. Secretary Morrison was laughing at something a defense contractor had said. Admiral Chen was discussing budget allocations with a congressional staffer. These were good people, dedicated servants who had devoted their lives to protecting the country. Yet they all existed within a system that had once authorized the torture of American personnel in the name of national security. "What about your own culpability?" Hayes asked, grasping for some way to discredit Mitchell's claims. "You admit you were directly involved in Warren's death. You designed the protocols that killed him. Why should anyone trust the word of someone who participated in murder?" Mitchell's expression didn't change, but Hayes saw something flicker in his pale eyes. Pain, regret, and something that might have been relief. "You're absolutely right, Admiral. I am a war criminal. I participated in torture and murder under the protection of military authority. I followed orders that violated every principle I had been taught to uphold. And for 57 years I've been a coward who chose personal security over moral courage." The admission hung between them like a confession. Hayes realized that Mitchell wasn't seeking absolution or trying to minimize his own guilt. He was simply stating facts with the clarity of someone who had spent decades examining his own conscience. "But that doesn't change what happened," Mitchell continued. "It doesn't resurrect James Warren or heal the damage done to the other subjects. And it doesn't protect future servicemen from similar abuses if the institution refuses to acknowledge what it's capable of." Hayes found himself thinking about his granddaughter, who had just been accepted to the Naval Academy. Would she serve in an institution that had truly learned from its past mistakes? Or would she become part of a system that simply buried its crimes deeper and developed more sophisticated methods of avoiding accountability? "Thomas, I need time to think about this. This isn't something I can decide sitting in a ballroom at a cocktail party. These documents need to be authenticated. Your claims need to be verified through official channels." "Admiral," Mitchell interrupted gently, "I'm dying. The doctors were very clear about my prognosis. I don't have time for lengthy authentication processes or bureaucratic reviews. This may be the last opportunity I have to ensure this information reaches someone in a position to act on it." The urgency in Mitchell's voice was unmistakable, and Hayes realized he was being forced to make a decision that would define the rest of his life. He could take the documents and begin a careful, classified investigation that might eventually lead to some form of internal acknowledgement. Or he could refuse the information and watch Thomas Mitchell take his secrets to the grave, leaving Ghost 5 buried forever. "What happens if I refuse?" Hayes asked. Mitchell reached into his jacket one final time and withdrew a business card. "Then I contact Ms. Sarah Chen at the Washington Post. I've already spoken with her briefly about the possibility of a story regarding classified Navy operations during the Cold War. She seemed very interested in pursuing the matter." Hayes felt his blood turn to ice. Sarah Chen was one of the most respected investigative journalists in Washington, known for her meticulous research and fearless pursuit of government accountability. If Mitchell gave his story to Chen, it would become front-page news within weeks, triggering congressional investigations, criminal referrals, and a media firestorm that would devastate the Navy's reputation. "You're blackmailing me," Hayes said quietly. "I'm giving you a choice, Admiral. The truth about Ghost 5 is coming out regardless of what you decide today. The only question is whether it comes out through proper military channels with institutional leadership taking responsibility, or whether it comes out through investigative journalism with the Navy looking like it's still trying to cover up war crimes." Hayes understood now that Mitchell had planned this confrontation carefully, leaving him with options that all led to the same destination. The old man wasn't seeking revenge or trying to destroy the Navy out of spite. He was offering the institution an opportunity to confront its past with dignity before having that past exposed without warning. "If I agree to pursue this through official channels," Hayes said slowly, "what guarantee do I have that you won't go to the press anyway?" Mitchell smiled, and for the first time it seemed genuinely warm. "You have the word of a dying man who has spent 57 years learning the difference between honor and obedience, Admiral. Make the right choice, and I'll trust you to see it through." Admiral Hayes sat in his Pentagon office 3 weeks later, staring at the formal report that would either save his career or end it. The investigation he had quietly initiated had confirmed every detail of Thomas Mitchell's story. Substation Baker 7 had existed. Operation Ghost 5 had been real. James Warren had died under circumstances that could only be described as murder under the color of military authority. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. Personnel records showed that Thomas Mitchell had indeed been assigned to naval intelligence operations in the Philippines. Medical files confirmed the existence of experimental psychological programs. Most damning of all, Hayes had found a classified memo from Admiral Kellison explicitly authorizing the use of enhanced interrogation techniques on recovered American personnel suspected of enemy conditioning. Hayes had spent sleepless nights reading through the complete documentation, each page revealing new horrors that challenged everything he believed about military honor. The systematic nature of the abuse, the clinical detachment of the reports, the casual way that human suffering had been documented and filed away. It painted a picture of institutional corruption that made him physically ill. He had verified Mitchell's claims through multiple sources, finding corroborating evidence in archives that had been sealed for decades. The truth was exactly as bad as Mitchell had claimed, possibly worse. Ghost 5 hadn't been an aberration or the work of rogue operators. It had been a carefully planned program with proper authorization and oversight. Now Hayes faced the most difficult decision of his career. The report on his desk contained recommendations that would send shockwaves through the military establishment. He was recommending a formal acknowledgement of Ghost 5, an official apology to the families of victims, and a comprehensive review of current interrogation and intelligence protocols to ensure such abuses could never be repeated. His phone rang, interrupting his brooding contemplation. "Admiral Hayes, this is Captain Rodriguez from Walter Reed Medical Center. I'm calling about Thomas Mitchell. He asked me to contact you when—" The voice paused. "I'm sorry to inform you that Mr. Mitchell passed away this morning. He had been asking about you regularly over the past few weeks." Hayes closed his eyes, feeling the weight of Mitchell's final gift. The old man had given him enough time to verify the truth and make his decision, but not enough time to delay indefinitely. It was as if Mitchell had planned even his own death to maximize the moral pressure on Hayes. "Captain, did Mr. Mitchell leave any final messages?" "Yes, sir. He asked me to tell you that he trusted you to do the right thing, and that his granddaughter would be proud to serve in the Navy you create." The line went quiet for a moment. "Admiral, I don't know what that means, but he seemed to think you would understand." Hayes understood perfectly. Mitchell's granddaughter represented the future of the Navy, young officers who would serve with the same idealism that had once motivated Thomas Mitchell himself. The question was whether they would serve in an institution that had learned from its past mistakes or one that continued to bury its crimes beneath layers of classification and institutional denial. After ending the call, Hayes picked up his secure phone and dialed the number for the Chief of Naval Operations. Admiral Patricia Williams had been his mentor for over a decade, and she deserved to know what was coming before it became public knowledge. "Pat, I need to see you immediately. I have information about a Cold War intelligence operation that's going to require immediate action at the highest levels." His voice was steady, despite the magnitude of what he was about to reveal. "Bill, you sound serious. How bad is it?" Hayes looked at the photograph of James Warren that now sat prominently on his desk, a reminder of the human cost of institutional secrecy. "It's career-ending bad for a lot of people, Pat, and it's going to test everything we claim to believe about military honor." An hour later, Hayes sat across from Admiral Williams in her secure conference room, watching her face as she read through Mitchell's documentation. He had seen Williams handle crisis situations before, but never anything like this. The implications went far beyond a simple historical review. They touched on fundamental questions about military accountability and civilian oversight. "Jesus Christ. Bill," Williams said finally, setting down the last document, "this is going to destroy us. Congressional hearings, criminal investigations, media coverage that will make Abu Ghraib look like a parking ticket. Are you absolutely certain this is authentic?" "I've verified it through multiple channels. It's real, Pat, all of it." Hayes leaned forward. "The question now is how we respond. We can try to bury it again and hope it never surfaces. Or we can get ahead of the story and demonstrate that the modern Navy is capable of confronting its past mistakes." Williams was quiet for several minutes, clearly weighing the political and institutional implications. Hayes knew she was thinking about her own career, the careers of everyone in their chain of command, and the broader impact on naval operations worldwide. "What do you recommend?" she asked finally. Hayes had been preparing for this question for weeks. "Full disclosure. Official acknowledgement of Ghost 5. Formal apology to victim families. comprehensive review of current protocols, and commitment to ensuring this never happens again. We control the narrative by telling the truth before someone else forces us to. That's career suicide for both of us. Bill. And it could cripple Navy recruitment for years, maybe. Or maybe it demonstrates that we're an institution capable of moral courage when it matters most. Hayes thought about Mitchell's granddaughter, about his own nephew, about all the young people who would choose to serve based on their belief in military honor. Pat, what kind of Navy do we want to leave for the next generation? Admiral Williams stared out the window at the Potomac River, where Navy vessels had patrolled for over 2 centuries. When she turned back to Hayes, her expression had hardened into the look of command decision. "Draft the disclosure statement," she said quietly. "We'll present it to the Secretary next week. And Bill, make sure it's complete. If we're going to do this, we're going to do it right." Hayes felt a weight lift from his shoulders for the first time in weeks. The decision had been made, and there was no going back. Thomas Mitchell's final mission was complete. He had found an officer willing to choose honor over convenience, truth over institutional protection. 6 months later, Admiral Hayes stood before a congressional committee, answering questions about Operation Ghost 5 with complete honesty. His career was effectively over, but his conscience was clear. The Navy's reputation had taken a severe blow, but it had also demonstrated a capacity for moral courage that strengthened its foundations. And somewhere, Thomas Mitchell's granddaughter was beginning her first year at the Naval Academy, serving an institution that had finally learned the difference between loyalty and complicity.